The coastal bar was packed with the usual Friday night crowd, a mixture of local fishermen, off-duty military personnel, and tourists looking for an authentic experience near the naval base. The wooden floors creaked under the weight of dozens of boots and shoes, and the air was thick with the smell of beer, fried food, and salt from the ocean just a few hundred yards away. Neon signs advertising various beer brands cast a dim, colorful glow across the faces of patrons who laughed, argued, and told stories that grew more exaggerated with each passing drink. Sarah Mitchell sat alone at the far end of the bar, her small frame hunched slightly over a glass of whiskey that she hadn't touched in the last 20 minutes. She wore civilian clothes, simple jeans, and a dark blue hoodie, her brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. To anyone who glanced her way, she looked like just another local, perhaps a college student or a young professional unwinding after a long week. Nothing about her appearance suggested authority, power, or the kind of responsibility that would make seasoned warriors snap to attention. The bartender, a grizzled man in his 60s named Frank, had worked this establishment for over 30 years. He'd seen every type of person walk through those doors, from fresh-faced recruits to decorated admirals. He had a sense about people, an ability to read them that came from decades of observing human nature in its most unguarded moments. When Sarah had walked in an hour earlier, he'd noticed something different about her, something in the way she carried herself despite her casual appearance. But he kept his observations to himself, as good bartenders always do. At a table near the center of the room, a group of 6 men were growing increasingly loud. They wore civilian clothes too, but their bearing, their haircuts, and their physical conditioning made it obvious they were military. These weren't ordinary servicemen either. Their confidence bordered on arrogance, the kind that comes from knowing you're among the best at what you do. They were Navy SEALs, members of one of the most elite fighting forces in the world, and they carried that identity with them even when out of uniform. Marcus Chun, the unofficial leader of the group, was in the middle of a story about a training exercise gone wrong when one of his teammates, a massive man named Derek Thompson, interrupted him. Derek's attention had wandered to the bar, specifically to the woman sitting alone at the end. He nudged Marcus with his elbow, a smirk playing across his face. "Check out the girl at the bar," Derek said, his voice carrying further than he probably intended. "Looks like somebody's having a rough night. Maybe we should go cheer her up." The other men turned to look, and a ripple of laughter went through the group. It wasn't necessarily mean-spirited, at least not at first. It was the kind of casual objectification that happened in bars across the world, men sizing up women, making judgments based on appearance, assuming superiority based on nothing more than gender and circumstance. "I don't know, man," said Jake Peterson, another member of the team. "She looks pretty serious. Might not be interested in company." "That's the best kind," Derek responded, his grin widening. "The ones who act all tough and independent. They just need the right guy to break through that shell." Marcus laughed, shaking his head. "You're an idiot, Thompson. What makes you think she'd be interested in a gorilla like you?" "Because I'm charming as hell," Derek shot back, standing up from the table. "Watch and learn, boys. Watch and learn." Sarah heard the scraping of a chair and the heavy footsteps approaching, but she didn't turn around. She'd been in situations like this more times than she could count. Being a woman in the military came with challenges that her male counterparts would never fully understand. She'd learned to navigate the constant testing, the assumptions, the casual disrespect that was rarely intended as malicious but was exhausting nonetheless. Derek positioned himself at the bar next to Sarah, leaning against it with what he clearly thought was a casual, confident posture. Frank, the bartender, caught Sarah's eye for just a moment, a question in his expression. She gave the slightest shake of her head. She could handle this herself. "Hey there," Derek said, his voice friendly but with an undertone of condescension. "You look like you could use some company. Nobody should drink alone on a Friday night." Sarah took a slow sip of her whiskey, still not looking at him. "I'm fine, thanks." "Come on, don't be like that," Derek continued, undeterred. "My friends and I are just having a good time over there. You should join us. We're way more fun than sitting here by yourself." "I appreciate the offer," Sarah said, her tone polite but firm. "But I'm good where I am." Derek's friends were watching from the table, some encouraging him with gestures and grins, others looking slightly uncomfortable with the interaction. Marcus was shaking his head, knowing his teammate well enough to recognize when Derek had decided to make something into a challenge. "Let me guess," Derek said, leaning in a bit closer. "Bad breakup? Tough day at work? Whatever it is, I guarantee a few drinks with us will make you feel better. We're Navy SEALs, you know. We've got some pretty incredible stories." The mention of Navy SEALs made Frank, the bartender, pause in his work. He glanced at Sarah again, and this time he noticed the briefest flicker of something in her expression. Not fear, not intimidation, but something that might have been amusement or perhaps irony. "That's impressive," Sarah said, finally, turning to look at Derek for the first time. Her eyes were sharp, intelligent, and completely unimpressed. "Thank you for your service." Derek took her acknowledgement as encouragement. "See, I knew you'd come around. So what do you say? One drink with us. If you're not having fun, you can always come back to your lonely corner of the bar." I said no. "Thank you," Sarah repeated, her voice harder now. "I'm sure you're all very impressive, but I'm not interested." The rejection stung Derek's pride, especially with his friends watching. His expression shifted, the friendly facade cracking slightly to reveal irritation underneath. "You know, you could at least be nice about it. We're out here protecting people like you, and you can't even have a civil conversation." Sarah set down her glass carefully, her jaw tightening. This was the line she'd heard so many times before, the implication that she owed something, that her freedom and safety were gifts bestowed by others rather than rights she'd fought for herself. "People like me," she repeated quietly, more to herself than to him. "That's an interesting phrase." "Yeah, civilians," Derek said, his tone now openly dismissive. "People who don't understand what it takes to do what we do. The sacrifices we make." Frank had stopped pretending to work and was now watching the interaction with intense interest. A few other patrons had noticed the tension and were turning their attention toward the bar. Sarah was aware of the audience, aware that how she handled this moment would matter, not just for her own dignity, but for what it represented. "I'm sure the sacrifices are significant," Sarah said, standing up from her bar stool. At her full height, she was several inches shorter than Derek, but there was something in her posture that made the height difference irrelevant. "And I'm sure you've earned the right to be proud of your service." "Damn right we have," Derek said, crossing his arms over his chest. "More than some, but," Sarah interrupted, her voice cutting through his words with quiet authority, "that service doesn't entitle you to anyone's time or attention. And it certainly doesn't give you the right to be disrespectful when someone declines your invitation." Derek's face flushed red. His friends had gone quiet at their table, sensing that the interaction had taken a turn. Marcus stood up, preparing to intervene, but something held him back. There was something about the woman's bearing, something in the way she held herself, that gave him pause. "Disrespectful," Derek laughed, but it was a forced sound. "Lady, I was just trying to be friendly. You're the one with the attitude problem." "I politely declined your invitation 3 times, Sarah said, her voice still calm but with steel underneath. "You're the one who couldn't accept that answer. You're the one who felt the need to lecture me about sacrifice and service. So let me ask you something. What unit are you with?" The question caught Derek off guard. What unit?" Sarah repeated. "You mentioned your Navy SEALs. I'm curious which team." Derek's chest puffed up slightly. "Team 7. We just got back from a deployment in the Middle East." "Why, you want to thank us properly now?" Sarah nodded slowly, as if considering this information. "Team 7. Interesting. And you're stationed at Coronado?" "That's right," Derek said, his suspicion growing. "How do you know about Coronado?" "Lucky guess," Sarah said with a slight smile. "It's where most of the SEAL teams on the West Coast are based. Tell me, did you enjoy your deployment? Successful operation?" Derek's friends were now standing, making their way toward the bar. Marcus reached them first, putting a hand on Derek's shoulder. "Hey, man, maybe we should just head back to the table." But Derek shook him off, too committed to the confrontation now to back down. "It was classified, not that it's any of your business. But, yeah, we accomplished the mission. We always do." "I'm glad to hear it," Sarah said. "Mission success is what matters most. The safety of the team, the achievement of objectives, and getting everyone home. That's always the priority." There was something in the way she said it, a familiarity with the language and concepts that made Marcus's instincts flare. He looked at Sarah more carefully now, taking in details he'd missed before. The way she stood, the economy of her movements, the directness of her gaze. This wasn't just some civilian in a bar. You seem to know a lot about military operations, Marcus said carefully, his tone much more respectful than Derek's had been. Are you military yourself? Or maybe a contractor? Sarah met his eyes, and Marcus saw immediate recognition there. She knew he'd figured something out, that he was smarter than his friend, more observant. I work with the Navy, she said simply. Doing what? Derek demanded, still aggressive. Pushing papers? Making coffee for the real warriors. The words hung in the air, offensive and ignorant. Frank, the bartender, actually winced. He'd served long enough to know that the real power in the military was rarely about who could lift the most weight or shoot the straightest. It was about intelligence, strategy, leadership, and the ability to make life-or-death decisions under impossible pressure. Sarah looked at Derek for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, she reached into her pocket and pulled out her wallet. From it, she extracted a simple ID card and placed it on the bar where all of them could see it. The ID wasn't like a civilian driver's license. It had security features, official seals, and a designation that made Marcus's eyes go wide. Derek leaned in to look, his face going from red to pale in a matter of seconds. Oh my God, Jake Peterson whispered from behind them, having gotten close enough to see. Oh my God, Derek, do you know who this is? Sarah picked up the ID and returned it to her wallet, her expression neutral. Commander Sarah Mitchell, she said quietly. I'm the officer in charge of Naval Special Warfare Group 1's Operations and Training Division. That means every SEAL team on the West Coast, including your Team 7, operates under my command authority. The silence that fell over that section of the bar was absolute. Derek looked like he'd been punched in the stomach, his mouth opening and closing but no words coming out. Marcus had snapped almost to attention, his body responding to the revelation before his mind had fully processed it. The other team members had various expressions of shock, embarrassment, and dawning horror. Ma'am, Marcus managed to say, his voice strained. We had no idea. Sarah held up a hand. At ease. You're off duty, and I'm not in uniform. There's no way you could have known. But Derek wasn't off the hook, and he knew it. His earlier arrogance had completely evaporated, replaced by a fear that was almost painful to watch. He'd just sexually harassed and insulted a superior officer, someone with the power to end his career with a few words. The irony was crushing. He'd bragged about his service and sacrifices to the very person who oversaw those operations, who made the decisions that kept him and his teammates alive. Commander, Derek started, but his voice cracked. I am so sorry. I was completely out of line. I had no right to speak to you that way. Rank aside. I was disrespectful and inappropriate, and I take full responsibility. Sarah studied him for a moment, watching as one of the cockiest men in one of the cockiest military units in the world crumbled under the weight of his own mistakes. She could destroy him right now. One report, one official complaint, and Derek Thompson's career as a Navy SEAL would be over. He'd be reassigned, possibly disciplined, certainly never trusted with the same level of responsibility again. But Sarah had been in the military long enough to understand that people made mistakes. She'd been disrespected countless times, had faced doubt and discrimination throughout her career. She'd also learned that the best leaders knew when to enforce consequences and when to teach lessons in other ways. Petty Officer Thompson, she said, using his rank for the first time. You made several errors in judgment tonight. Can you identify them? Derek swallowed hard. Yes, ma'am. I approached someone who clearly wanted to be left alone. I persisted after being told no. I made assumptions about you based on your appearance and gender. I was condescending and disrespectful, and I used my military service as a way to claim superiority over someone I assumed was a civilian. Sarah continued speaking, her voice firm but not harsh. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to go back to your table, finish your drinks quietly, and then you're going to go home and think about what happened here tonight. Monday morning, you're going to report to my office at 0800 hours. We're going to have a longer conversation about professionalism, respect, and what it means to be a SEAL both in and out of uniform. Derek nodded quickly. Yes, ma'am. Absolutely. I'll be there. I'm not writing you up, Sarah said, and she saw the relief flood through Derek's features. Not this time. But understand this, your actions reflect on your entire team, your entire unit, and the reputation of naval special warfare. If I ever hear of you or any of your teammates conducting yourselves this way again, the consequences will be severe. Are we clear? Crystal clear, ma'am, Derek said, his voice stronger now. It won't happen again. You have my word. Sarah looked at the other men gathered around. That goes for all of you. You're warriors, yes. You're highly trained, highly skilled, and you serve a vital role in our nation's defense. But that doesn't make you better than anyone else. It makes you responsible to a higher standard. You represent something bigger than yourselves. Marcus spoke up, his voice respectful. Understood, Commander. And for what it's worth, I apologize too. I should have intervened sooner. I should have stopped this before it got to this point. You're right, you should have, Sarah agreed. As a senior member of your team, you have a responsibility to your brothers. That includes protecting them from their own poor judgment sometimes. Leadership isn't just about combat situations. Yes, ma'am, Marcus said, his jaw tight with self-recrimination. I failed in my duty tonight. Sarah's expression softened slightly. You recognize the problem. That's the first step. Make sure you remember this lesson. Your team needs you to be better than you were tonight. The tension in the air was still thick, but it had shifted from confrontational to educational. The other patrons in the bar had mostly returned to their own conversations, though many were still casting curious glances toward the group at the bar. Frank, the bartender, was watching Sarah with undisguised admiration. He'd seen a lot in his years behind that bar, but he'd never seen someone handle a difficult situation with such a perfect balance of authority and restraint. Sarah picked up her glass of whiskey and finished it in one smooth motion. She set the glass down gently and turned back to the group of SEALs. Gentlemen, enjoy the rest of your evening. Remember what we talked about. I'll see Petty Officer Thompson on Monday. Yes, ma'am, came the unified response. As Sarah turned to leave, Derek found his voice again. Commander, may I ask you something? Sarah paused, looking back over her shoulder. Go ahead. Why didn't you tell me who you were right away? Derek asked. You could have shut me down immediately. Why let it go on? Sarah considered the question for a moment. Because I wanted to see how far you'd take it. I wanted to see if you'd do the right thing on your own, if you'd recognize that your behavior was inappropriate regardless of who I was. The fact that I'm your commanding officer makes your actions worse from a military standpoint, but it doesn't make them wrong. They were wrong because of how you treated another human being. That's the lesson I hope you take from this. Derek nodded slowly, the weight of her words sinking in. I understand, ma'am. Thank you for the lesson instead of the court-martial. Don't thank me yet, Sarah said with a slight smile. Monday's conversation isn't going to be pleasant, and you're going to have additional duties for the next month. Community service, sensitivity training, and you're going to write me a paper on professional conduct and why it matters in special operations. Derek actually smiled despite himself. That's fair, ma'am. More than fair. Sarah nodded and headed toward the door. As she passed other tables, a few people who had figured out what happened nodded respectfully to her. One older man, clearly a retired military officer himself, actually stood as she passed, a gesture of respect that Sarah acknowledged with a brief nod. When the door closed behind her, the group of SEALs stood in silence for a long moment. Then, Jake let out a long breath. Derek, you just hit on our commanding officer. You told our commanding officer that we protect people like her. You basically sexually harassed one of the most powerful people in naval special warfare. Don't remind me, Derek groaned, dropping his head into his hands. I think I'm going to be sick. You should be sick, Marcus said, but his tone wasn't entirely unsympathetic. That was a disaster. But it could have been so much worse. How? Derek asked, looking up. How could that have been worse? She could have destroyed you, Marcus said simply. Right there, right then. She could have called the MPs, had you arrested for conduct unbecoming. She could have filed an official complaint that would have followed you for the rest of your career. She could have made an example of you. But she didn't. Why didn't she? Asked another team member, Tom Richardson, who had been silent throughout the entire encounter. Marcus thought about it for a moment. Because she's a good leader. She saw an opportunity to teach instead of punish. She gave Derek a chance to learn from this, to be better. That's what the best officers do. Frank, the bartender, approached the group with a fresh round of beers. These are on the house, boys. Consider it a consolation prize for what might be the most educational experience of your military careers. Derek looked at the beer, then shook his head. Thanks, Frank, but I think I've had enough for tonight. I need a clear head to think about what just happened. Smart choice, Frank said approvingly. He looked at the rest of the group. You fellas might want to follow his example. You're all going to want to remember every detail of tonight. The team members gathered their things and prepared to leave. As they headed for the door, Derek paused and turned back to Frank. Hey, did you know who she was? When she first came in, Frank smiled enigmatically. I had a feeling she was somebody important. 30 years behind this bar, you develop an instinct for these things. But I didn't know specifically who she was until she showed that ID. Why didn't you warn me? Derek asked, not accusingly, but genuinely curious. Because it wasn't my place, Frank said simply. And because some lessons need to be learned the hard way. You're a lucky man, son. Most people don't get second chances like that. Derek nodded soberly. Yeah, I'm starting to realize that. The team left the bar and walked out into the cool night air. The ocean was visible in the distance, waves reflecting the moonlight. The beauty of the scene felt almost mocking given the turmoil Derek was experiencing internally. I can't believe I did that, Derek said to no one in particular. I can't believe I was so stupid. We all make mistakes, Marcus said, clapping him on the shoulder. The question is what we do about them. Commander Mitchell gave you a chance to make this right. Don't waste it. I won't, Derek promised. Monday morning, I'm going to walk into that office with a plan. I'm going to show her that tonight was an aberration, not who I really am. Good, Marcus said. Because if you screw this up, it's not just your career on the line. It reflects on all of us. The weight of that statement settled over the group as they walked toward their cars. Derek had learned a harsh lesson about assumptions, respect, and the danger of letting ego override judgment. But, more than that, he'd learned something about leadership that no training exercise could teach. He'd seen someone with absolute power choose restraint, choose education over punishment, choose to believe in someone's potential rather than define them by their worst moment. Back in the bar, Frank was cleaning up the area where the confrontation had taken place. Another regular, an old salt named Jimmy who'd witnessed the entire thing, approached the bar with a grin on his weathered face. That was something else, Frank, Jimmy said, shaking his head. That young guy had no idea who he was messing with. None at all, Frank agreed, chuckling. The look on his face when she showed that ID. I've seen men take enemy fire with more composure. She handled it well, though, Jimmy observed. Could have crushed him, but she showed mercy. That's a good officer. Frank nodded thoughtfully. That's more than a good officer, Jimmy. That's someone who understands that leadership isn't about wielding power. It's about building people up, even when they don't deserve it. Especially when they don't deserve it. Think he'll show up Monday? Jimmy asked. Oh, he'll show up, Frank said with certainty. That young man just had a wake-up call. He's going to show up early, probably with that paper half-written already. He's going to spend all weekend thinking about nothing else. Good, Jimmy said, taking a sip of his beer. Maybe he needed this. Sometimes the best lessons come from the biggest mistakes. Frank raised his glass in agreement. Ain't that the truth? Meanwhile, Sarah was driving home along the coastal highway, her windows down to let in the salt air. The encounter at the bar played through her mind, but not with anger or resentment. Instead, she felt a sense of satisfaction. She'd handled it well, maintained her composure, and turned what could have been a destructive situation into a teaching moment. Her phone rang, and she glanced at the screen to see it was her mentor, Admiral Patricia Reeves, retired but still deeply connected to the naval special warfare community. Sarah answered through the car's Bluetooth system. Sarah, I just got the most interesting phone call, Admiral Reeves said, her voice warm with amusement. Word travels fast in our community. I heard you had an encounter at Murphy's bar tonight. Sarah couldn't help but smile. News really does travel fast. It only happened 30 minutes ago. Frank called me, Admiral Reeves explained. He's an old friend, and he thought I'd want to know. He said you handled yourself beautifully. I did what needed to be done, Sarah said simply. Nothing more, nothing less. You showed restraint, Admiral Reeves observed. A lot of officers, especially women who've had to fight for every ounce of respect they've received, would have come down hard on that young man. But you chose a different path. He made a mistake, Sarah said. A bad one. But it doesn't have to define his career. If I had ended him tonight, what would that have accomplished? It wouldn't have made him a better person. It wouldn't have made him understand why his behavior was wrong. It would have just destroyed a talented SEAL and sent a message to his team that there's no room for growth or redemption. That's wise beyond your years, Admiral Reeves said approvingly. But tell me honestly, how did it make you feel? To be treated that way, talked down to, disrespected like that. Sarah had grown up in a small town in Ohio, the daughter of a factory worker and a nurse. Military service ran in her family. Her grandfather had served in World War II, her father in Vietnam, though the experience had left him with scars both visible and invisible. From a young age, Sarah had been fascinated by stories of strategy and leadership. While other girls her age were playing with dolls, she was reading books about Alexander the Great, Napoleon, and Patton. When she announced her intention to join the Navy after high school, her father had been conflicted. He was proud of her desire to serve, but he knew the challenges she would face. The military in the late 90s was still very much a man's world, and women who dared to enter traditionally male domains faced resistance at every turn. Sarah, her father had said one evening, sitting across from her at their small kitchen table, "I'm not going to tell you not to do this. You're smart, you're tough, and you've got the heart for it. But I need you to understand what you're signing up for. It's not just going to be about being good at your job. You're going to have to be twice as good as any man just to be considered half as capable. You're going to face doubt, resistance, and disrespect. Are you ready for that?" "I am," Sarah had replied with the confidence of youth. "I'm not doing this because it's easy. I'm doing this because it matters. Because someone has to be first. Someone has to show them that women can do this too." Her father had smiled sadly. "Just promise me you won't let them break you. Don't let them take away what makes you special, your compassion, your sense of justice. The military needs people who can think differently, who bring new perspectives. Don't lose that trying to be just like them." Those words had stayed with Sarah throughout her career. They'd sustained her through the Naval Academy, where she'd graduated in the top 10% of her class despite facing skepticism from instructors who doubted a woman's place in combat operations. They'd guided her through her early assignments, where she'd had to prove herself repeatedly, where every mistake was magnified and every success was minimized or attributed to luck. She remembered one particularly difficult assignment early in her career, serving as a junior officer on a destroyer. The commanding officer, an old-school captain named Braddock, had made no secret of his belief that women didn't belong on combat ships. He'd given her the most challenging assignments, seemingly hoping she would fail and prove his prejudices correct. But Sarah had excelled. She'd worked harder than anyone else, studied more, prepared more thoroughly. When the ship had faced a genuine crisis, an engine room fire that threatened to spread, it had been Sarah's quick thinking and leadership that had organized the damage control efforts and prevented catastrophe. Even Captain Braddock had been forced to acknowledge her competence, though he'd done so grudgingly. "Lieutenant Mitchell," he'd said to her after the crisis had been resolved, "you performed adequately today. Perhaps I was too hasty in my initial assessment of your capabilities." It wasn't much of a compliment, but, coming from Braddock, it was practically a glowing endorsement. More importantly, Sarah had earned the respect of her fellow officers and the crew. They'd seen her in action, seen her remain calm under pressure, seen her make the right calls when lives were on the line. That respect was far more valuable than any official commendation. As her career progressed, Sarah had continued to break barriers. She'd been among the first women to serve in certain special operations support roles. She'd deployed to war zones, not in a combat capacity. The rules hadn't allowed for that yet. But in intelligence and planning positions where her strategic mind and attention to detail had made her invaluable. One deployment to Afghanistan had been particularly formative. She'd been assigned as an intelligence liaison to a SEAL team, providing them with real-time analysis and strategic support. The team had been skeptical at first, but Sarah had quickly proven her worth. She'd identified patterns in enemy movement that had prevented ambushes. She'd provided targeting information that had led to successful operations. She'd worked around the clock, often going days with minimal sleep to ensure the team had everything they needed. The team leader, a grizzled senior chief named Martinez, had pulled her aside near the end of the deployment. "Ma'am, I'll be honest with you. When they told us we were getting a female intel officer, half the team groaned. We thought it was some politically correct nonsense, putting a woman in danger just to check a box. But you proved us wrong. You're one of the best officers I've ever worked with, male or female. You've got my respect and my gratitude." That acknowledgement had meant everything to Sarah. It wasn't about proving she was as good as the men. It was about proving she could contribute, that her unique perspective and skills had value, that diversity made teams stronger, not weaker. Her rise through the ranks had been steady but not easy. Each promotion brought new challenges, new skeptics to win over, new battles to fight. But she'd persevered, guided by her father's advice to never lose her essential self, to bring something different rather than just trying to fit in. When she'd been selected for her current position as commander of Naval Special Warfare Group 1's Operations and Training Division, it had been both a triumph and a tremendous responsibility. She was overseeing some of the most elite warriors in the world, men who had trained their entire adult lives for combat. Many of them had never served under a female commander before, and many were skeptical. Sarah's approach had been methodical and strategic. She didn't try to prove she was tough by being harsh or demanding. She didn't try to compete with the SEALs on their terms, acting like she could do everything they could do. Instead, she focused on what she brought to the table: strategic thinking, attention to detail, a commitment to the mission, and, perhaps most importantly, a genuine concern for the welfare of the men under her command. She'd made a point of learning about each team, understanding their strengths and challenges. She'd sat in on training exercises, not to interfere, but to observe and learn. She'd made herself available to team leaders, listening to their concerns and working to address systemic problems that had been ignored by previous commanders. One of her first major decisions had been controversial. During a training exercise, a SEAL candidate had been seriously injured due to what Sarah determined was negligence by the training staff. The staff, all experienced SEALs themselves, had pushed back hard when she'd recommended changes to the training protocols. They'd argued that SEALs needed to be pushed to their absolute limits, that the training was supposed to be dangerous. Sarah had stood her ground. Training should be challenging, even brutal at times. But it should never be unnecessarily dangerous. We're supposed to be preparing these men for combat, not killing them before they ever see action. There's a difference between pushing someone to their limits and being reckless with their lives. She'd implemented new safety protocols over the objections of the training staff. Some had predicted it would soften the program, that it would produce inferior SEALs. Instead, the opposite had happened. With better safety measures in place, training could actually be more intense in other ways. Candidates could push harder knowing that reasonable precautions were in place. The injury rate dropped significantly, but the standards remained just as high. Over time, even the skeptics had to admit that Sarah knew what she was doing. The teams under her command were performing at the highest levels. Mission success rates were exceptional. Morale was high. And, critically, she'd fostered a culture where excellence was expected but where people were also treated with dignity and respect. That's what made tonight's encounter at the bar so frustrating for her. She'd spent years building this culture, showing that strength and professionalism could coexist with respect and decency. And then, one of her SEALs had acted like a stereotypical jerk, objectifying a woman, being condescending, using his military service as a shield for bad behavior. But, as Sarah pulled into her driveway and turned off her car, she reminded herself that this was also an opportunity. Derek Thompson had made a mistake, but he'd also shown genuine remorse. He'd accepted responsibility and shown a willingness to learn. That was what mattered. That was how cultures changed, not through perfection, but through the willingness to acknowledge mistakes and grow from them. Her home was a modest 2-bedroom bungalow, nothing fancy, but comfortable and filled with personal touches that revealed more about Sarah than her Spartan military office ever could. There were photos on the walls, her graduation from the Naval Academy, her father in his Vietnam-era uniform, a picture of her with Admiral Reeves at her promotion ceremony. There were books everywhere, military history, leadership theory, biographies of great leaders, and, interestingly, several novels about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Sarah changed out of her civilian clothes and into comfortable sweatpants and a t-shirt. She made herself a cup of tea and sat down at her small desk, opening her laptop. Despite the late hour, she felt energized rather than tired. She pulled up Derek Thompson's personnel file, wanting to review it before Monday's meeting. What she found confirmed her initial assessment. Thompson was an exceptional SEAL by every measurable standard. His physical fitness scores were outstanding. His marksmanship was well above average. His performance reviews from team leaders were glowing, describing him as brave, reliable, and increasingly showing leadership potential. He'd been decorated for valor during his last deployment after pulling 2 wounded teammates to safety under heavy fire. But there were also hints of the attitude problem Sarah had witnessed tonight. Several reviews mentioned that Thompson could be overconfident or needed to work on interpersonal skills. One team leader had noted that Thompson sometimes struggled to take direction from support staff, particularly those he perceived as less experienced than himself. Sarah made notes as she read, already formulating her approach for Monday's meeting. This wasn't just about punishing Thompson for his behavior at the bar. It was about helping him understand how his attitude could limit his potential, how it could damage his team, and, ultimately, how it could get people killed. She thought about the SEALs she'd known who had struggled to transition from operators to leaders. The skills that made someone an excellent commando, physical prowess, aggression, absolute confidence in high-stress situations, were not necessarily the same skills that made someone a good leader. Leadership required empathy, the ability to see situations from multiple perspectives, the wisdom to know when to push and when to show restraint, and, crucially, the humility to recognize that you didn't have all the answers. Thompson had the potential to be more than just a good operator. Sarah had seen it in how he'd handled the situation once he'd realized his mistake. He hadn't made excuses or tried to deflect blame. He'd owned it completely. That took character. That showed the kind of self-awareness that could be developed into real leadership ability. But he needed guidance. He needed to. The weekend passed slowly for Derek Thompson. He barely slept Friday night, his mind replaying the encounter at the bar over and over, each time finding new layers of shame in his behavior. Saturday morning, he woke early despite his exhaustion and went for a run, pushing himself hard, trying to outrun the embarrassment that dogged his every thought. His apartment, a small one-bedroom place near the base, felt claustrophobic. The walls seemed to close in on him as he sat at his kitchen table, a blank notebook in front of him and a pen in his hand. Commander Mitchell had assigned him a paper on professional conduct, and, while it wasn't due immediately, Derek wanted to start working on it. He needed to do something productive, something that showed he was taking this seriously. But where to begin? He'd written plenty of reports during his career, after-action summaries, tactical assessments, equipment evaluations. But this was different. This required introspection, something Derek realized he wasn't particularly practiced at. He was a man of action, someone who dealt with problems by confronting them directly, physically. Sitting still and examining his own behavior, his own attitudes, and assumptions was unfamiliar territory. He started by writing down what had happened, a factual timeline of events from his perspective. He described approaching Commander Mitchell at the bar, the things he'd said, her responses, and the eventual revelation of her identity. Seeing it all written out made it even worse somehow. The pattern was so clear. He'd ignored repeated polite rejections, he'd been condescending, he'd made assumptions based on gender, and he'd used his military status as a weapon rather than a responsibility. Marcus called around noon. "Hey, how you holding up?" "I've been better," Derek admitted. "I can't stop thinking about it, man. How could I be so stupid?" "You made a mistake," Marcus said. "A bad one, but you're owning it. That counts for something." "Does it?" Derek asked. "I basically sexually harassed our commanding officer. I told her we protect people like her, as if she hasn't done more for this country than I probably ever will. I embodied everything wrong with the stereotype of SEALs as arrogant jerks." "Yeah, you kind of did," Marcus agreed, and Derek appreciated the honesty. "But here's the thing. Commander Mitchell gave you a chance to make it right. She could have destroyed you, but she didn't. She saw something in you worth saving. Don't waste that." "I won't," Derek promised. I'm already working on that paper she assigned. And I've been thinking a lot about what she said, about how my actions reflect on the whole team, the whole community. Good, Marcus said. Because it's true. We're not just individual operators. Everything we do, people see the SEAL trident first. We carry that responsibility everywhere we go. After hanging up with Marcus, Derek returned to his notebook. He started a new section, writing about what he'd learned about professional conduct from the experience. He wrote about respect, about how rank and position shouldn't determine how you treat people, about how everyone deserves basic human dignity regardless of their perceived status or role. He wrote about assumptions, about how he'd looked at Commander Mitchell and seen only a woman alone at a bar, someone he could hit on, someone he'd judged as lesser than himself without any real basis for that judgment. He wrote about how those assumptions had blinded him to obvious signs that she was more than what he'd assumed: her bearing, her confidence, her familiarity with military operations when they talked. The more he wrote, the more he realized how deeply his attitudes ran. It wasn't just about that one night at the bar. It was about a pattern of thinking that he'd never really examined. He thought about other times he'd made similar assumptions, times he'd dismissed support staff as less important than operators, times he'd been impatient with people who didn't meet his standards of physical fitness or tactical skill. He thought about a female intelligence analyst he'd worked with on his last deployment, a capable woman who'd provided excellent information, but whom Derek and some of his teammates had made jokes about behind her back. They hadn't been cruel jokes, just the usual locker room stuff about her appearance, speculation about her personal life. At the time, it had seemed harmless, just guys blowing off steam. But now, seeing it through the lens of what had happened with Commander Mitchell, Derek recognized it for what it was: disrespect, objectification, a failure to see her as a full person deserving of the same professional courtesy they showed to male colleagues. The realization was uncomfortable, but Derek forced himself to sit with it. This was what Commander Mitchell had given him, not just a punishment or a lesson about respecting superior officers, but an opportunity to examine himself honestly and recognize patterns he'd been blind to. Sunday morning, Derek attended church, something he didn't do regularly but felt drawn to that day. He sat in the back pew of a small chapel near the base, listening to a sermon about humility and service. The pastor, an energetic woman in her 40s, spoke about how true strength came not from power over others, but from lifting others up, from recognizing our shared humanity and treating everyone with dignity and compassion. Derek felt like the sermon had been written specifically for him. He sat there, supposedly one of the toughest warriors in the military, feeling his eyes sting with unexpected emotion. He'd been so focused on being strong, on being elite, on being a SEAL, that he'd forgotten to be a good person. He'd let his identity as a warrior become an excuse for behavior that contradicted the values that were supposed to define that identity. After the service, Derek approached the pastor. "Ma'am, thank you for that sermon. It really spoke to me today." The pastor smiled warmly. "I'm glad it resonated with you. Sometimes we all need reminders about what really matters. Can I ask you something?" Derek said hesitantly. "How do you apologize when words don't seem like enough? When you've hurt someone, and a simple sorry feels inadequate?" The pastor considered the question thoughtfully. "I think the best apology isn't just words. It's changed behavior. It's showing through your actions that you've learned, that you're committed to being better. Words can be meaningful, but they're just the beginning. The real apology happens over time, through consistent demonstration that you've truly changed." Derek nodded, absorbing this wisdom. "That makes sense. Thank you. Whatever you're dealing with," the pastor said kindly, "the fact that you're here, that you're thinking about this, that matters. A lot of people never get to that point. They defend their behavior or make excuses. You're doing the hard work of self-examination. That takes courage." Derek left the church feeling slightly better, or at least more clear about what he needed to do. He spent the rest of Sunday working on his paper, refining his thoughts, making sure he was being honest and thorough. By evening, he had a solid draft, several pages of genuine reflection on professional conduct and why it mattered. Monday morning arrived with the inevitability of a combat mission. Derek woke at 5, unable to sleep any longer. He showered, shaved carefully, and put on his uniform with more attention to detail than usual. Every crease had to be perfect, every button aligned exactly right. He needed to show through every aspect of his appearance that he was taking this seriously, that he understood the gravity of the situation. He arrived at Commander Mitchell's office at 7:30, a full 30 minutes before the scheduled meeting. The building was already busy with people starting their workday, and Derek received a few curious looks as he sat in the waiting area outside the commander's office. Word of what had happened at the bar had clearly spread, though Derek had no idea how much detail people knew. At precisely 7:55, Commander Mitchell's aide, a sharp young lieutenant named Collins, emerged from the inner office. "Petty Officer Thompson, the commander will see you now." Derek stood, straightened his uniform one last time, and walked into the office. Commander Mitchell was seated behind her desk, in uniform now, looking every inch the commanding officer she was. Her expression was professional, neutral, giving nothing away. "Petty Officer Thompson, reporting as ordered, ma'am," Derek said, standing at attention. "At ease," Commander Mitchell said. "Please have a seat." Derek sat in one of the chairs facing her desk, his posture rigid despite the instruction to be at ease. Commander Mitchell studied him for a moment, and Derek had the uncomfortable feeling that she could see right through him, reading every thought and emotion. "How was your weekend, Petty Officer?" she asked, the question seeming almost casual, but Derek knew better than to take it lightly. "Reflective, ma'am," Derek answered honestly. "I spent most of it thinking about Friday night, and what it revealed about my attitudes and behavior." "Good," Commander Mitchell said. "That's exactly what I hoped you would do. Tell me what you came up with." Derek took a breath, organizing his thoughts. "Ma'am, I realized that what happened Friday wasn't just a one-time mistake. It was a symptom of deeper issues with how I think about people, particularly women, and particularly people I perceive as civilians or outside the SEAL community. I've been operating with a sense of superiority that isn't justified, and that contradicts the values I claim to uphold." Commander Mitchell nodded slightly, encouraging him to continue. "I started working on the paper you assigned," Derek continued. "And, in doing so, I had to confront some uncomfortable truths about myself. I've been disrespectful to people throughout my career, not always in obvious ways, but in small dismissals and assumptions that add up. I've treated my status as a SEAL as something that elevates me above others rather than as a responsibility that requires me to be better." "Go on," Commander Mitchell said, her expression still neutral, but her eyes showing that she was listening carefully. "I also realized that this isn't just about me," Derek said. "When I acted the way I did Friday night, I wasn't just representing myself. I was representing my team, all SEAL teams, and the broader military. Anyone who saw that interaction would judge all of us based on my behavior. That's a responsibility I failed to live up to." Commander Mitchell leaned back in her chair slightly. "That's a good analysis, Petty Officer. You're identifying the real issues. Now, let me ask you this. Why do you think you developed these attitudes? Where do they come from?" Derek thought about the question carefully. "I think part of it is the culture, ma'am. Not making excuses, but SEAL training emphasizes being elite, being the best. That's necessary for the job we do, but somewhere along the way, I internalized that as meaning I'm better than people who aren't SEALs. The confidence that makes me effective in combat became arrogance in other contexts." "That's insightful," Commander Mitchell said. "And you're right that this is a cultural issue, not just an individual one. The elite warrior mentality is necessary for special operations, but it needs to be balanced with humility and respect for others. That's something we need to do better at instilling during training." She stood and walked around her desk, leaning against the front of it in a more casual posture. "Derek, may I call you Derek for a moment? Not as your commanding officer, but as someone who's been where you are." "Yes, ma'am," Derek said, slightly surprised by the shift in tone. Derek felt the weight of her words settling on him like a physical thing. "Ma'am, I understand. And I want to be better. I want to be the kind of SEAL who lives up to the values, not just the image." Commander Mitchell smiled slightly, the first real warmth she'd shown since Derek entered the office. "That's exactly what I wanted to hear. Now, here's what's going to happen. You're going to complete that paper you started, and I want you to really dig deep. I want you to research the psychology of prejudice and in-group bias. I want you to study examples of military leaders throughout history who exemplified true honor and respect. And I want you to propose concrete ways we can improve our culture to prevent the attitudes you've identified in yourself. Yes, ma'am, Derek said, making mental notes. You're also going to volunteer at the VA hospital for the next 3 months, every Saturday morning. 4 hours a week with veterans who've served their country and now need support. I want you to learn from them, to see service from a different perspective, to understand that there are many ways to be a hero. Derek nodded. I'd be honored to do that, ma'am. And, finally, Commander Mitchell continued, you're going to be my special assistant for the next month. You'll shadow me, attend meetings, see what command actually involves. You're going to learn what it takes to lead at this level, and you're going to see firsthand how the decisions we make impact the lives of the people under our command. This last assignment surprised Derek. Ma'am, are you sure? After what I did, you want me working directly with you? I'm sure, Commander Mitchell said firmly. Derek, I'm not doing this to punish you. I'm doing this because I see potential in you. You could be a squad leader, maybe eventually a team leader. But you need to understand that leadership isn't about being the toughest or the most skilled. It's about bringing out the best in others, making sound decisions under pressure, and maintaining integrity even when no one's watching. I won't let you down, ma'am, Derek said, meaning it with every fiber of his being. See that you don't, Commander Mitchell said, returning to her professional tone. Now, your first assignment as my assistant starts today. We have a meeting with the base commander in 30 minutes to discuss resource allocation for training operations. I want you there, observing. Pay attention to how different perspectives are valued, how decisions are made collaboratively, and how respect is maintained even when there's disagreement. The meeting was an education for Derek. He sat quietly in the corner as Commander Mitchell met with the base commander, a 2-star admiral named Harrison, along with several other senior officers. They discussed budgets, training schedules, equipment needs, and personnel issues. What struck Derek most was how Commander Mitchell operated in this environment. She was confident, but never arrogant. She advocated strongly for the needs of her teams, but acknowledged the constraints other departments faced. When the base commander challenged one of her proposals, she didn't get defensive. Instead, she asked clarifying questions, listened to his concerns, and worked collaboratively to find a solution that addressed everyone's needs. Commander Mitchell, Admiral Harrison said at one point, I appreciate your willingness to work with us on this. Some of my other department heads could learn from your approach. You're firm about your requirements, but flexible about how we meet them. Thank you, sir, Commander Mitchell replied. I've learned that the best solutions usually come from collaboration, not confrontation. We're all working toward the same goal, keeping our forces ready and our people safe. How we get there matters less than that we get there together. After the meeting, as they walked back to Commander Mitchell's office, Derek couldn't help but comment. Ma'am, that was impressive. The way you handled Admiral Harrison when he pushed back on the equipment request, you didn't fight him, but you didn't back down either. You found a middle ground. That's called leadership, Derek, Commander Mitchell said. And it's something you need to learn if you want to advance in your career. Being a good operator is about individual excellence. Being a good leader is about bringing out excellence in others, building coalitions, and understanding that you don't have all the answers. Over the next few weeks, Derek's education continued. He accompanied Commander Mitchell to training exercises, where he saw her interact with SEAL candidates. She was demanding but fair, pushing them hard but never losing sight of their humanity. When a candidate was struggling, she didn't just wash him out. She took time to understand why, to see if the issue was fixable or if the candidate genuinely wasn't suited for the program. He sat in on counseling sessions where Commander Mitchell dealt with personal issues affecting team members, marriages under strain from repeated deployments, financial problems, struggles with the transition back to civilian life after years of service. She listened without judgment, provided resources and support, and followed up to ensure people were getting the help they needed. Derek also saw the administrative side of command, the endless paperwork, the bureaucratic battles to secure resources, the difficult decisions about personnel assignments, and mission priorities. It was exhausting work that required skills Derek had never appreciated. Combat operations, as intense as they were, had a clarity to them. You had a mission, you executed it, and you either succeeded or failed. Command was far more ambiguous, full of competing priorities and imperfect choices. One afternoon, about 2 weeks into his assignment as Commander Mitchell's assistant, they were reviewing after-action reports from a recent training exercise. One of the teams had performed poorly, missing objectives and showing poor coordination. The team leader, a respected senior chief, had submitted a report that basically blamed the support staff for providing inadequate intelligence and logistical support. Commander Mitchell read the report carefully, then looked up at Derek. "What's your assessment of this situation?" Derek considered the question. A few weeks ago, he would have probably sided with the team leader. SEALs were the tip of the spear, and if they failed, it must be because their support wasn't good enough. But his time with Commander Mitchell had given him a different perspective. "Ma'am, I think the senior chief is deflecting responsibility," Derek said carefully. "The intelligence provided was adequate based on what I've seen in the files. The team's performance issues seem to be more about internal coordination and preparation. He's blaming others to avoid acknowledging his own team's shortcomings." Commander Mitchell nodded. "That's my assessment too. So how would you handle this?" "I'd meet with the senior chief privately," Derek said, thinking it through. "Point out the discrepancies between his report and the actual facts. Give him an opportunity to revise his assessment and take ownership of the real issues. If he refuses, then it becomes a matter of integrity, and there would need to be consequences." "Good," Commander Mitchell said. "That's exactly what we're going to do. And you're going to be in that meeting with me. I want you to see how this kind of conversation goes." The meeting with the senior chief was uncomfortable. He was defensive at first, trying to maintain his narrative that the support staff had let his team down. But Commander Mitchell was patient and methodical, walking through the evidence point by point, showing where his claims didn't match the reality. She wasn't harsh or accusatory, but she was relentless in pursuing the truth. Eventually, the senior chief cracked. "You're right, ma'am. I screwed up. My team wasn't prepared, and I wasn't leading them effectively. I blamed others because I didn't want to admit I'd failed." "I appreciate your honesty," Commander Mitchell said, her tone softening. "Now, let's talk about what actually went wrong and how we fix it. Your team has the talent. The question is what prevented them from executing effectively." They spent the next hour doing a genuine after-action review, identifying the real issues and developing a plan to address them. By the end, the senior chief looked relieved rather than defensive. He'd been able to acknowledge his mistakes in an environment that was focused on improvement rather than punishment. After he left, Commander Mitchell turned to Derek. "What did you learn from that?" "That accountability doesn't have to be destructive," Derek said. "You held him responsible, but you did it in a way that helped him grow rather than just tearing him down. And by focusing on fixing the problem rather than assigning blame, you made it possible for him to be honest about what happened." "Exactly," Commander Mitchell said. "Leadership isn't about catching people doing things wrong. It's about creating an environment where people can acknowledge mistakes and learn from them. That's how we get better as individuals and as an organization." Derek's Saturday mornings at the VA hospital were equally transformative. He met veterans from every era, from World War II survivors in their 90s to recent combat veterans his own age. He heard their stories, learned about their struggles, and saw firsthand that heroism came in many forms. One veteran, a Marine named Johnson who'd lost both legs in Iraq, made a particular impression on Derek. Johnson was in his 40s now, working as a counselor helping other veterans deal with physical and psychological trauma. Despite his own injuries, he radiated positivity and purpose. "You're a SEAL, right?" Johnson said one Saturday, having picked up on clues from how Derek carried himself. "Yes, sir," Derek confirmed. "Let me tell you something," Johnson said. "I was a Marine grunt. Not special operations, not elite, just a regular infantryman. But I served with honor, I did my job, and I took care of my brothers. That's what mattered. Not whether I was the most elite or the most skilled, but whether I did right by the people who depended on me." "I'm learning that lesson, sir," Derek said honestly. "Good," Johnson said. "Because the elite warrior thing, that's important for the mission. But it can mess with your head if you let it define your entire identity. You're more than your job. You're more than your physical capabilities. The truest measure of a warrior isn't how tough he is. It's how he treats people when he doesn't have to, when there's nothing in it for him, when no one's watching. Derek thought about that conversation often in the weeks that followed. He thought about it when he was tempted to dismiss someone's contribution or assume superiority. He thought about it when interacting with support staff, making a conscious effort to show respect and appreciation for their work. He thought about it when he was back with his team, trying to model a different kind of leadership than he'd shown before. His teammates noticed the change. Marcus pulled him aside one afternoon after training. "Hey, man, I don't know what Commander Mitchell is doing with you, but it's working. You're different. Better." "She's teaching me what I should have learned a long time ago," Derek said. "That being elite isn't about thinking you're better than everyone else. It's about holding yourself to a higher standard of behavior, not just capability." "That's deep," Marcus said with a grin. "But, seriously, the team's noticed. You're more patient during training, more willing to listen to ideas from junior guys. You're becoming the kind of leader people want to follow, not just someone they follow because they have to." The month of Derek's special assignment went by quickly. On his last day working directly with Commander Mitchell, she called him into her office for a final conversation. "Derek, you've completed your assignments well," she said. "Your paper on professional conduct was thoughtful and honest. Your work at the VA hospital has been noted by the staff there, who say you've been engaged and compassionate. And your performance as my assistant has exceeded my expectations. You've shown me that you took this seriously, that you genuinely wanted to learn and grow." "Thank you, ma'am," Derek said. "This month has changed how I see my role, my career, and myself. I'm grateful you gave me this opportunity instead of just ending my career." Commander Mitchell smiled. "I told you that first night, Derek. I saw potential in you. I still do. But now I see something more. I see someone who's committed to living up to that potential, to being not just a skilled operator, but a leader of character." She stood and extended her hand. Derek shook it, struck by the gesture of respect and equality it represented. "You're going back to your team tomorrow," Commander Mitchell said. "But I'll be watching your career with interest. I expect big things from you, Derek. Don't let me down." "I won't, ma'am," Derek promised. "You have my word." As Derek left her office for the last time as her assistant, he reflected on the journey of the past month. He'd entered this experience in disgrace, having made one of the biggest mistakes of his career. He was leaving it with a completely different understanding of what it meant to be a SEAL, a leader, and a good person. 6 months later, Derek was recommended for promotion to squad leader. The recommendation came from Commander Mitchell herself, who noted in her evaluation that Derek had shown exceptional growth in leadership ability and demonstrated a commitment to professional excellence that went beyond technical skills. Derek's squad quickly became known as one of the best in the team. He led with a combination of high standards and genuine respect for his team members. He mentored junior SEALs, not just in tactical skills, but in character development. He made a point of showing appreciation for support staff, building relationships that improved coordination and mission effectiveness. When Derek's team was selected for a particularly challenging deployment, Commander Mitchell came to see them off. She pulled Derek aside briefly before they boarded the transport. "Remember what you learned," she said simply. "Lead with honor." "Always, ma'am," Derek replied. The deployment was successful. Derek's squad accomplished every mission objective and, crucially, brought everyone home safely. In his after-action reports, Derek made sure to credit everyone who'd contributed, from the intelligence analysts who'd provided targeting information to the support personnel who'd maintained their equipment. He'd learned that excellence was never individual, it was always collective. Years later, Derek would look back on that night at the bar as a turning point. Not because of the embarrassment or the consequences, but because of what came after. Commander Mitchell could have destroyed him, but she'd chosen to build him up instead. She'd seen past his mistakes to his potential, and, in doing so, she'd changed the entire trajectory of his career and his life. He would go on to become a respected team leader, known for tactical excellence, but also for treating everyone with dignity and respect. He would mentor dozens of younger SEALs, passing on not just technical skills, but the lessons about character and leadership that Commander Mitchell had taught him. And whenever he saw someone being disrespectful or dismissive of others, he would remember that night at the bar and the patient, firm way Commander Mitchell had turned a moment of failure into an opportunity for growth. For Commander Mitchell, Derek Thompson's case became one of many examples of why she approached leadership the way she did. She could have ended his career that night at the bar, and no one would have questioned her decision. But by choosing to teach rather than punish, to build rather than destroy, she'd helped create a leader who would positively impact countless other people throughout his career. It wasn't always easy. There were times when Commander Mitchell had to make harder calls, when someone's behavior was so egregious or their refusal to change so absolute that mercy wasn't appropriate. But she always started from a place of believing in people's capacity to grow, of giving them the opportunity to be better than their worst moments. Her approach to leadership continued to evolve and to influence the culture of naval special warfare. She pushed for changes in training that emphasized character development alongside physical and tactical skills. She championed mentorship programs that paired experienced leaders with junior personnel. She created environments where mistakes could be acknowledged and learned from rather than hidden and repeated. Not everyone agreed with her methods. Some of the old guard thought she was too soft, that the elite warrior culture required a harder edge. But the results spoke for themselves. Teams under her command consistently performed at the highest levels. Mission success rates remained exceptional. And, critically, the incidence of unprofessional conduct, both on and off duty, decreased significantly. Other officers, both male and female, began to study Commander Mitchell's leadership style and implement similar approaches in their own commands. She became a sought-after speaker at leadership conferences, where she would often tell the story of Derek Thompson, though without using his name, as an example of how the choice between punishment and teaching could shape not just an individual career, but an entire organizational culture. As for the bar where it all started, Murphy's became something of a legend within the naval special warfare community. Frank, the bartender, would occasionally tell the story of that night to regulars who could be trusted with it. It became a cautionary tale for young SEALs, a reminder that appearances could be deceiving and that respect should be universal, not contingent on rank or status. The story of Commander Mitchell and Derek Thompson spread through the community in various forms, details changing in the retelling, but the core message remaining constant. Treat everyone with respect. Don't let your elite status become arrogance. Remember that leadership is about character as much as capability. And understand that the most powerful response to disrespect is often not revenge, but grace. In the end, that night at the bar became more than just an embarrassing incident for Derek Thompson or a moment of disrespect endured by Sarah Mitchell. It became a teaching moment that rippled outward, influencing countless interactions and shaping the culture of one of America's most elite military units. It proved that sometimes the greatest displays of strength come not from dominating others, but from lifting them up, not from wielding power, but from showing restraint, and not from being right, but from helping others learn to be better. I've spent my entire career fighting against assumptions people made about me based on my gender, Commander Mitchell said. I've had to prove myself over and over, had to be twice as good to be considered half as competent. It's exhausting and it's unfair, but it's been my reality. Do you know what I learned from that experience? Derek shook his head. No, ma'am. I learned that everyone is fighting battles we can't see. Everyone has had to overcome obstacles, face doubts, prove themselves in their own ways. The fishermen at that bar, the bartender, the tourists, they all have their own stories, their own challenges, their own forms of courage. My path doesn't make me better than them. It just makes me different. She paused, making sure Derek was really hearing her. You are an exceptional SEAL. Your record proves that. You're brave, skilled, and dedicated. But those qualities don't exist in a vacuum. They need to be grounded in character, in values, in respect for others. Otherwise, you're just a highly trained weapon, not a warrior in the true sense of the word. Understand that being a SEAL wasn't just about physical capabilities or even tactical skills. It was about representing something larger than yourself, about understanding that every action on duty and off reflected on the teams and the broader special operations community. Sarah spent another hour reviewing training schedules and operational reports, then, finally, closed her laptop and headed to bed. As she lay in the darkness, she thought about the journey that had brought her here, the challenges she'd overcome, the people who'd supported her, and those who'd tried to hold her back. She thought about her father, now elderly, and living in a retirement community but still sharp as ever. She made a mental note to call him tomorrow, to tell him about tonight's incident. He'd appreciate the irony of it, and he'd probably have some wisdom to share about handling the follow-up meeting. Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering her answer. It made me angry. It made me tired. It reminded me of every time I've had to prove myself, every time someone assumed I couldn't do this job because of my gender. But it also reminded me why I'm in this position. I'm not just here to command operations. I'm here to shape the culture, to build better leaders, to create an environment where talent and dedication matter more than gender or background. You're doing important work, Sarah, Admiral Reeves said seriously. The old guard, they don't always see it. But people like you are changing the military for the better. You're proving that strength comes in many forms, that leadership isn't about who can yell the loudest or lift the heaviest weight. I'm just doing my job, Admiral, Sarah said. But there was gratitude in her voice. You're doing more than that, Admiral Reeves corrected. You're setting an example. And tonight, you showed those young SEALs something they might not have learned any other way. That's valuable. They talked for a few more minutes before saying their goodbyes. As Sarah continued her drive home, she thought about the path that had brought her to this point. It hadn't been easy. Nothing in her career had been easy. Sarah nodded. That's a good start. What else? Derek thought for a moment, his face showing genuine remorse now. I embarrassed my team. I failed to represent the SEALs with the professionalism and honor they deserve. And I let my ego override my judgment and basic human decency. Better, Sarah said. Now let me tell you something, petty officer. You're a good SEAL. I've reviewed the reports from your last deployment. You performed with distinction under fire. You demonstrated leadership when your squad leader was injured. And you brought everyone home alive. That matters. That's the person you're supposed to be. Derek nodded, looking at the floor. Thank you, ma'am. But I wasn't that person tonight. No, you weren't, Sarah agreed. Tonight you were a man who let his position and pride make him forget basic respect and decency. That's not who I need leading missions. That's not who your teammates need watching their backs. Marcus and the other team members were watching this exchange with rapt attention. They were seeing something rare, a senior officer who could have ended a career instead choosing to teach. It was a masterclass in leadership, and they all knew it.